And hello, and welcome to this month's episode of Haunted Histories. As you probably have all seen, I'm going to have quite a busy 2024. I've got the scary Southwest Conference in March, then I'm attending all three of the Haunted Antiques Parameets next year, and I've got the Festival of the Unexplained, amongst other things that I'm talking about. But if you do want to speak to me about an event, please feel free to get hold of me. Now, I was put in touch with this person by the historian Dr. Nicola Tallis because we'd been talking about a character by the name of Lady Jane Grey. And it's one of the ones that some of you said you'd like me to do a podcast on. So here you go. I'd like to welcome Lee Porritt of the Lady Jane Grey Revisited website. Hi, Lee.
Hello, Penny.
Hi, thanks ever so much for joining us. Now, Lady Jane Grey, having read Nicola's book on her and sort of done some reading up on other things as well, I do think hers is a story which has been mistold time and time and time again. And I do have sort of some things I'd like to ask your opinion on, but what is it that got you into Lady Jane in the first place?
Um, I for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated in the story of Lady Jane Grey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you touched on it slightly there. I, thought I knew quite a lot about Jane Grey as a child and researched quite a lot into her. And then, in the past sort of 20 years, historians have started to challenge some of the stuff that is generally thought to have been known about Jane Grey, and that a lot of what we actually thought was Jane Grey's story is actually a lot of myth and legends that surround
Yeah.
her. We've had some fantastic historians go back to the original sources from the time and try to identify the true Jane Grey.
Mm-hmm.
And she's very slowly starting to come to the surface now.
Mm-hmm.
She's definitely one of those characters that is in the top 10 most famous Tudor figures today.
Mm.
However, we know very little about the real Lady Jane Grey.
Mm.
Her story is an extremely complex one, but it's an interesting one as well. And unfortunately, the ending is very sad.
Mm.
It's one of those stories that just leaves you wanting more.
Mm. I think one of the things that I'm looking at your website, which if anyone's interested in Jane, head over to the website, which I will be putting links on all my social media and stuff when I promote this podcast. It's the fact that there's all these pictures reported to be her, like paintings of her, and you have done this amazing research looking into whether there is really an image of her out there. I mean, where do you start with that?
Um, I think it's more to do with her fame. So I think anybody over the centuries has claimed to own a portrait of Lady Jane Grey. It's a little
Mm-hmm.
bit like sort of the Holy Grail, having
Mm.
an image of this famous queen.
Mm.
And images were deemed to be very rare.
Mm.
So lots of people claim to own images of Jane Grey. However, it turns out that a lot of these images her name was just simply applied to a painting that was thought at that time to look similar or
Right.
represent Jane Grey. Jane Grey has gone down in history as a bit of a bookworm. So quite a
Yeah.
lot of pictures of 16th century females holding books or reading books have become portraits of Lady Jane Grey.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you look into the provenance and the history related to those images, you find that sadly they're not. They turn out
Mm.
not to be an image of Jane. We do have 16th century accounts of portraits of Jane Grey. Unfortunately, we don't have any that relate to her lifetime.
Right.
We have some that are related to within the first, I think it's about the first 10 years after her death,
Right.
people portraits start to show up in collections. So we know that they did exist.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find that smoking gun as yet, and that is a portrait that we know for definite is Lady Jane Grey. And I think that that's one of the other things that makes her story so interesting, is that we don't really know what she looked like. We
Yeah.
don't, you know, we thought we had quite a detailed description of Jane Grey, and that was published in a 1909 biography on her. And unfortunately, that recently is now turned out to be a fake.
Oh, right.
So she sort of she likes what I quite like about Jane is she sort of appears through. She appears in various times. She appears, but then she disappears. If you get what I mean, she gets quite easily taken away. So Jane has been taken away again from us. However, there is quite a few of us out there that are looking for portraits of Jane Grey, and
Yeah.
hopefully one day one may pop up somewhere.
Because I think, I mean, if we sort of talk about her story. I mean, we've got to bear in mind that, yes, the ending was really sad. It was on the 12th of February, 1554. She was executed at the Tower of London. And we believe she was 17 years old. Isn't that correct? She was about 16, 17, around that sort of age. She was a teenager. She was a young woman, very young woman. She was born to the granddaughter, was it, of
She was the she was the granddaughter of Henry VII. So she was born between the end of 1536 and the beginning of 1537. Again, we don't exactly know the exact date. It was never recorded. However, she was the granddaughter of Henry VII and was the niece of Henry VIII, which then made her cousin to Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. So she was very closely connected to the royal family. And actually, her childhood, we have very little information about her childhood. We don't really know where she spent most of her childhood. We presume that she travelled from house to house with her family and visited various members of the royal family. She's actually documented quite regularly as visiting Mary. She had quite a close relationship with Mary by the sounds of it at the beginning. There is details in Mary's accounts where she gave gifts to Jane, and Mary was very close to Jane's mother, Frances. So we know very little about her childhood. She starts to appear in records around 1544 when Henry VIII starts to look at the line of succession again. He puts Elizabeth and Mary back into the line of succession. However, he refuses to take away their illegitimate status. What Henry also does is he names Jane as next in line to the throne once if Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward were to die without any children. So she starts to appear there, and that's when people start to take a little bit of notice of her. She appears again around the time of Henry's death. So in around 1547, again, she starts to appear in public record again. She moves in with Catherine Parr, which is the final queen of Henry VIII, and her husband Thomas Seymour. This was not this was a normal thing to do for somebody of a high status, a high-born status. They could quite often go to stay in other people's households to finish their education. To learn skills about how households were ran, and to refine court manners. So it was quite a normal thing to do. However, during the stay with Catherine and Thomas Seymour buys Jane's wardship off Jane's father, Henry Grey. And there's some discussion about her possibly marrying Edward VI, the king.
Yeah.
There is no discussion prior to this, prior to 1547. There is a long-standing tradition that Jane and Edward were destined to be together, and they had a beautiful childhood and a beautiful relationship where they were playful friends and were educated together. Unfortunately, there is no documentation to support that. The documentation starts at 1547 with the possibility of Jane marrying Edward.
I mean, if that had been something that they were planning, like Henry had been planning to marry his niece off to his son, which, you know, even though it's quite a close link, cousins did marry to keep in the line of and all that. Wouldn't it have been documented somewhere? Wouldn't there have been a letter between him and Henry Grey, if nothing else, saying this, or even him to to Francis, saying, you know, I'd like to marry my son off to your daughter?
It would, and there isn't any letters or any evidence prior to 1547 about the thought of Jane marrying Edward. In fact, Henry VIII wanted Edward to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and there's lots of documents about that.
Okay.
Edward, you know, Henry had his heart set on Edward marrying the Scottish Queen, and unfortunately that that didn't work. So she goes to live with Catherine Parr. She is starting to people are starting to become really interested in her. And one of the reasons why is Henry Grey was very much into education and very much into religious reform, and he had all three of his daughters educated. Again, this was normal for the time. Women were being high-born women were being educated to basic standards, and were able to read and write. However, the difference with Jane is Jane excelled in her learning, and she seems to have really quite enjoyed it. She, by the time of her death, so by the time she was 16, 17, it's reported that she could speak several languages, including Greek, Italian, Latin, and I think she was even learning Hebrew.
I think in Nicola's book, she mentions that Jane either translated a book for one of her teachers from English to Greek or Greek to English. I can't remember which way round it was, but we're talking ancient Greek here. And that alone is a pretty amazing thing to be able to do at such a young age.
Yeah. And people were noticing it. So people were actually starting to become really interested in the possibility of what was going to happen with this young girl and what she was going to achieve. She started, awareness about her started to become, people started to become really interested in her. What I really like about it is, again, the Victorian impression of Jane that we were told is Jane was a bit of a bookworm. She spent all the time reading books and was quite shy and quite timid. There's some fantastic letters from Jane's tutor to various people that are asking. He's asking various people to educate Jane on the appropriate time to spend on music and the appropriate clothing that she should be wearing and the time that she should be braiding and combing her hair. It sounds like she fell off the wagon a little bit and started to be that teenager. Her tutor was trying to sort of rein her back in again. And that's one of the things that I do like with Jane's story, that every once in a while you get that glimpse of humanity.
Of a young girl, just growing up. Yeah.
Just growing up, and that's one of the really nice things that you do sort of see within Nicola's book. You get
Yeah.
that within Nicola's book, that those hints of the real Jane come through quite a lot. Yeah. So obviously Catherine Parr dies, and Thomas Seymour is executed for high treason. And Jane is sent back to her family. She spends the next few years, traveling around again with her family and attending some court events. She's not, she's documented as at some of the court events. But unfortunately, at the beginning of 1553, King Edward starts to become really ill. And Edward's in a bit of a dilemma. He doesn't necessarily get on with his older sister Mary. There is a bit of religious differences going on there.
Yeah.
Mary is refusing to not hear mass, and Edward is getting a bit angry about this, and Edward believes that the Protestant faith is the true religion. Mary believes the Catholic faith is the true religion.
Now we have to put stress here. Jane was a Protestant, wasn't she? She was a very, very staunch Protestant. Yeah.
Jane was a Protestant, yeah. And so he starts to fall ill at the beginning of 1553, and he starts to look at the line of succession. And this is where it gets a bit complex. So the early drafts for Edward's device of the succession sort of hints that he doesn't particularly want to have a female ruler.
Right.
He wants a male to rule England. Sadly, the Tudor family tree has none. There's no male. They're all females. So what he does is he originally makes a device. He makes the succession that the male heirs of Lady Jane will inherit the throne. And this is where Jane is hastily married off. She's married off to the youngest son of his chief advisor, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland.
Guildford Dudley.
Yes, Guildford Dudley. And Guildford, and this marriage, so the marriage is announced in April of 1553, and they're married in the May of 1553. And as soon as this marriage happens, there is instant suspicion about what is going on. People are not sure about what is happening, and everyone is very suspicious about John Dudley. And one of the things that causes the suspicion is Jane is the firstborn daughter of a duke, and she is marrying, I think Guildford was the 5th or 6th child of a duke, which was quite low in rank for Jane. And I think Jane and her mother knew this and were actually quite against the marriage. So yes, this marriage instantly causes suspicion among the court and amongst the people of the country. And she unfortunately, Edward's illness becomes quite dramatically worse, and he changes the device of the succession again. Jane has produced a child, and he then leaves to Lady Jane and her children, totally eliminating Mary, his sister, and Elizabeth. Although Elizabeth was a Protestant, he could not eliminate Mary without eliminating Elizabeth. They were both classed as illegitimate, and he could then move on to Mary. So yes, he changes. It is literally with one stroke of a pen that Jane's fate is sealed. Basically, Edward dies on the 6th of July, and Jane is she's immediately made queen. From the moment that he dies, the country is run in Jane's name. There is some confusion as to when Jane was informed about the events that were going to happen. Some of the articles on my website I hint to the fact that she knew prior to Edward's death. She wasn't that naive. She
Yeah,
knew that something was going on, and her mum, Frances Grey, was within 2 weeks of, 2 weeks prior to his death, to Edward's death, was invited to court to speak to the king.
yeah.
And this is probably where King Edward told her of the plan that was going to happen. And I personally believe Jane knew a little bit more than when she was actually just informed that she was queen. She knew that something was going to happen. So Jane is informed that she's queen. She takes possession of the tower on the 10th of July. However, the reign isn't very good. Nobody really knows her.
Right.
Nobody really knows who she is or where she's come from. People are very rigid in the way that, they wanted. They can remember good King Henry's line of succession, the 1544 line of succession. People think that that's how it should follow and it's the right way of going. And there's chaos. There's chaos for about 2 weeks. Mary proclaims herself queen,
Mm.
and we have two queens of England. For the first 2 or 3 days of Jane's reign, things actually look quite good, and it looks like she's actually going to remain queen. However, as the reign progresses, people just start to turn towards Mary. The country turn towards Mary. Mary has a massive army, and Jane sadly loses.
Mm.
She loses the battle.
Do you
During
think,
the reign,
sorry, do you think though that part of that was because Jane was so young? Mary was obviously slightly older. Also, was there an awful lot of um, later Catholics who actually like the thought of having a Catholic monarch again? That it means they could be themselves again?
I think it had a lot to do with tradition. I just think people
Right.
thought that Mary should really inherit the throne, and that was the proper line of succession. And I think what the problem was there wasn't enough time to secure the plan to secure Jane's throne. If it had gone through Parliament, if it had, it might have been slightly different.
Right.
Um, Northumberland is sent out to capture Mary during the reign.
Mm.
Mary isn't captured. Northumberland is eventually captured himself,
Mm.
and Jane is informed that she's no longer queen. She remains in the tower. She's no longer. She's taken to other lodgings within the tower, and she's stripped of everything. She's stripped of all of her personal items, and is held under guard. Northumberland is very quickly tried and executed.
Mm.
And again, this bit's quite complex. The Grey family blame the Dudleys.
Mm.
The Dudley family blame the Greys, as well as Edward VI and the King's Council. And even Jane herself blames the Dudleys. She
Mm.
accuses the Dudley family of trying to poison
Mm.
her. So yeah, there's quite a lot of chaos as to what's going on. Jane writes a letter within the first few weeks of her imprisonment to Mary, detailing her side of the story. And it appears that Mary seems to believe Jane.
Mm.
She frees her father and Henry Grey from the tower, and she gives an audience to Frances Grey, and she just concentrates on the first few months of her reign, just
Mm.
stabilizing herself as queen, and things go a little bit quiet. Jane remains in the tower, and she faces trial along with Guildford on the 13th of November and the remainder of the Dudley brothers. Jane is accused and found guilty of signing herself as queen. and she is condemned to either be burnt at the stake or beheaded at the Queen's
Yeah.
pleasure. At this time in her story, it's generally thought that that would never happen, that Jane would eventually be pardoned or she'd be kept under house arrest, and things would go quite quiet. Unfortunately, Jane, from the minute that Mary inherits the throne, there is that paranoia that Mary will turn England Catholic and force people to the Catholic religion, to pick and choose their own religion.
Yeah.
There is a lot of suspicion around that she may force the Catholic religion onto England, and there is discussion about her marriage. He makes it quite clear that she wants to marry Philip of Spain, her cousin, who is also a Catholic.
Yeah.
This causes a lot of uproar and starts what is now known as Wyatt's Revolt. Thomas Wyatt and a lot of other noblemen got involved, including Henry Grey, and decided that they were going to try and stop the Spanish match and possibly overthrow Mary. Jane isn't really mentioned at all in Wyatt's Revolt. It's more around Elizabeth. However, Wyatt's Revolt, they reach London it's about the 7th of February in 1554, and Wyatt has just completely misjudged the mood of the country. Although they may not like the Spanish match, they're still very, very on Mary's side, and they want Mary to be queen. And everything just falls to pieces. And this is where Mary decides that she has to execute Lady Jane Grey.
Is it Mary who decides that, though, or is it her advisors? Do we have anything documenting it? Because it's a bit like when Elizabeth had Mary, Queen of Scots, executed. There's an awful lot of stuff saying she didn't really mean to do it. It was her advisors who kind of bullied her into doing it. Is it a similar situation with her sister and Jane?
I don't believe that Mary wanted to kill Jane. I don't believe she did, and I think she really fought with herself about the decision. She was getting lots of pressure from the council as well as the Spanish to get rid of anything that may cause upheaval within the kingdom. And I just think that Wyatt's rebellion was the last nail in the coffin that sort of tipped Mary over the edge, and people again were able to then use Jane is dangerous. We need to get rid of her. Mary tries everything she possibly can to not save Jane's life, but save Jane's soul. She was quite determined that she wants Jane to have a good death, and she sends her chaplain to the Tower to have the now famous debate between Jane and Dr. Feckenham. And she tries everything she possibly can to just make it a little bit easier for Jane. Unfortunately, the events happen, and on the 12th of February, Jane is escorted from her rooms at the Tower, and she's executed at the age of 16 or 17. The interesting thing is, the minute she dies, that's when all the myths and all it's if we look at her afterlife, she seems to be constantly used to promote one thing or another thing, and she seems to fit in all. Jane's story, and Jane herself is manipulated to fit in every little box. She's promoted to. She's used to promote the Protestant faith. She's used to promote education. She's used to promote how a female should behave. She seems quite easily fitting into all of these boxes. And this is the one, like I said earlier on, this is one of the interesting things, is that we're really now starting to see Lady Jane Dudley. She died Lady Jane Dudley. Today she's known as Lady Jane Grey. We, she signed her prayer book, Lady Jane Dudley. We are now getting to see the real person. Guildford Dudley is sort of pushed to the footnotes in Jane's story, in the earlier versions of Jane's story. Their relationships made out to be horrid, and it's a really interesting one. A lot of that again relates from the Greys that blamed the Dudley camp and were trying to pull Jane away from the Dudley camp. Yeah, it is just it's just very interesting.
I mean, I've watched a few documentaries on it in my time. I don't know how accurate. Well, actually, doing the research I've done now, some of them were very much fiction. But one of the things I was always led to believe, that Jane was quite a bimbo puppet for the men, which isn't the case. She wasn't a bimbo in any way, shape, or form. Also, that John Dudley wanted to get to the crown. He wanted to somehow be as close to being a king as he could ever be. And the only way he was ever going to do it was to marry off one of his children to a ruler of England. And that's why he pushed for Guildford to marry Jane. And then apparently because Jane refused to make Guildford king when she was queen, that caused issues. Is that true?
Yeah. So Jane definitely refused to make Guildford king. Jane was very outspoken. She knew what she wanted, and I think she knew that she was being used. She knew that she was being used slightly, and she knew the reasons why. And she believed that if she was going to be queen, she was going to be queen alone, and she was going to rule the country herself. Again, I think there's lots of myths surrounding the Duke of Northumberland and whether he was out to literally scheme to the crown and get a position for himself, or whether he was actually just following the king's wishes and the council's wishes at that time. He had the council's backup, and the council signed all of the device to the succession. Whether John was the scapegoat of the whole thing, it's debatable. And I think it's quite, in the documentation sort of shows that Jane didn't particularly like John Dudley. She didn't particularly get on with him very well, and I know that she was very taken back when he changed his religion before he died. He converted to Catholicism.
Yeah.
And Jane is documented as speaking out quite abruptly about that. Personally, I look at that from both sides. I look at it from the fact that, yes, I look at it from Jane's side, that she was angry about that, but then I also look at it from John's side, John Dudley's side, that he knew he was going to die, and he needed to save and make sure that his family was secure. His children were safe and his wife was safe, and he did what he thought was the most appropriate thing to do, which was to convert at the time to what people were saying was the true religion. So it's not it's not, it's sometimes not as black and white as what it's made out,
Yeah.
if you get what I mean.
I do wonder what he would have thought, though. I mean, if we could, we're going to talk about ghosts in a minute, because obviously this is also a paranormal and history podcast. But it does make me wonder if you could speak to him and say, you see how close your other son got to being on the throne, so to speak, with the did they didn't they relationship with Elizabeth, one of the greatest monarchs in my view. Even though I'm not actually a Tudor, I'm more Plantagenet, if I'm completely honest, because
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to the documentary that's on this evening, the Richard III one, to see what its evidence is that they've found, because I've been watching the banter between Matt Lewis and Nathan Ammon on social media for the last few days, and it's absolutely hilarious. But I do think Elizabeth was an amazing woman, an amazing queen, an amazing monarch. And I just wonder what John would have thought if he'd seen how close his young son got to being, well, a king, for want of a better term. It would be really interesting to see if he ever thought that was possible, or if when the whole Guildford and Jane thing didn't work out, he thought that's it. But I mean, the changing of religion, I interpreted it. I like your interpretation, because I did wonder if it was a way of him trying a last ditch attempt to be forgiven himself, because I don't know. I struggle not to go with he manipulated Jane because of what he wanted to achieve for the Dudley family, and he saw it as a way of doing it. I mean, could when when Edward changed the succession just before he died, could his advisors really have vetoed it?
Again, that's a difficult one to answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
It could have possibly happened. I think there would have been a lot of uproar about it. But I think what would have happened is we'd have probably have seen the same uproar as what we saw during Jane's reign, which was lots of people saying, "What's going on? Who's this young girl? Where's Mary?" It is a difficult one, but I do think sometimes that Edward is underestimated in the story. We're talking about somebody that is, he's he's his father's son, and
exactly what I was going to say. He's been treated like a mini deity since he was born, because he was the amazing boy, the king, the one and he's the fact that his mother as well is Henry treated her, so he said she was the love of his life, she was the one true love of his life. And I always sort of say that had she survived the birth, I mean, I know she didn't die actually at childbirth, but it's to do with the childbirth, would he have still been with her 10 years on? Probably not. He probably would have fallen out with her like he did with everyone else. So, but it's because she pretty much died giving him what he wanted. He's got this sort of, so this child has been treated like the golden child, and probably had quite an ego about him. And also, like you say, his father's son. Let's face it, Henry was never lacking in self-belief.
No, I think that this, all signs were showing with Edward that he was sort of turning a little bit like that himself, and that he believed that what he said was, what he says goes, and everybody had to scumble around and try and sort that out. Sadly, it just had a huge impact on Jane's life, on Guildford's life, and on the life of Jane's sisters as well. That whole crisis of 1553 just travelled right down till the last Grey sister died. Like I've said earlier, it's quite a sad story. Considering that they were probably the most innocent ones in it. Jane was very much she very much stated that although she'd accepted the crown, she never actually wanted it. When she was offered the crown, she she was refusing. She refused the crown and was saying it's not hers, it's not her right. I think, she wanted the proper lines to
Yeah.
follow. But unfortunately was talked into by, not just, she wasn't just talked into by the Duke of Northumberland, she was talked into by Henry Grey and her mother, to follow this plan through. And yeah, and just unfortunately it just didn't work. It
So
didn't.
how much influence do you think her mum Frances did actually have on her decisions?
Again, Francis is another one that's been really heavily manipulated over the course of time. Again, if you look at the documentation from the 16th century, it sounds like Jane was actually quite close to her mum. Whenever Jane was in need, she seemed to have run to her mum. And both Catherine Grey and Mary Grey were very close to her mother. So I don't think Frances was as manipulative figure that looked like Henry VIII that lots of people say. I think she was sort of turned into a bit like the evil queen of Jane's story, that would beat Jane, and it's quite a again difficult thing to sort of get your head around. I think that the relationship was actually quite good. And just because we don't have letters, that survive today from Jane to her mum in the final weeks of her life, doesn't mean that those were not written.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes trying to think of both sides of the actual story, because we don't know. We just don't know.
It's something that it would be amazing to find, because I always wondered, why was it Jane, not Frances, who was asked to take on the role of Queen? Because Frances had more of an entitlement to it than her daughter did. Was it because she was slightly older? Because all of that thing. And then when you look at if Mary was, because it's another thing about Mary that I kind of get a bit, maybe it's being female, I get a bit protective. But when people call her Bloody Mary and she just killed loads of people, well, actually, she didn't kill as many people as people think. I'm pretty sure she killed less than her little brother did. Her little brother, he's, for those who can't, he's nodding. Her little brother killed more people than she ever did. And if she was that bloodthirsty and she killed Jane out of like a fit of pique or, annoyance at this young girl had usurped her throne, she would have killed Frances as well. She would have wiped out the whole family. If she was that much of a crazed murderer, as she seems to be painted sometimes. Now, I mean, I can't understand killing someone because they believe in a different religion to me. Well, I don't believe in religion, so that's a moot point. But back then, it was a fact. If you didn't believe in the correct religion, you would be classed as being a heretic, and the punishment for heresy was execution. It's just the way it was. But I think Mary is much maligned a lot of the time. I think, I actually admire her for sticking up for herself a bit. And I do think, though, I think that I do feel that Jane was a pawn in a game that she had no control over what was going to happen. Because is there any way she could have avoided being executed? Could she have done something that would have meant they said, okay, fine?
I don't think there was any way that she could have not been executed. I think just the threat of Jane's life had become that prominent that Mary unfortunately just had to get rid of her. Mary, I suppose we've also got to think about Mary as well. Mary, like what you said, she's another figure at the minute that is, our perceptions of Mary are recently changing. There is lots of myth that surrounds Mary and a lot of propaganda that was made during Elizabeth's reign to make Mary out to be this evil evil figure.
Mhm.
And again, we're now trying to get to the bottom of Mary, and I think Mary had quite a sad life and quite a difficult life. She seemed to have had to fight from such a young age
Yeah,
that
definitely.
um, by the time she inherited the throne, she must have not known where to look, or not
Mm.
known who to trust, or um, have probably have had a lot of doubt and paranoia around
Mm.
herself. And I think it had just got to the point where the only thing that she could think of was that she had to get rid of her.
Mm.
Um, and um, yeah, that's just the sad end to the story, that these
Mm.
two women were both put in positions where one had to die for the other one to succeed.
Yeah.
Um, and Jane is very aware of. I believe that Jane knew that she was going to go in the history books.
Mm.
I believe that Jane knew that her story was going to be talked about and going to last a long time.
Mm.
And before Jane's death, she was writing various letters and saying various things to promote the Protestant faith. And again, I think Mary was probably aware of that, and that Jane was starting to become a little bit outspoken, even though she was a prisoner.
Mm.
So there is that element of the story as well. She didn't necessarily stay hidden in the tower and quiet and again
Mm.
read her books. She continued to say and do speak her mind and say and do things what she thought was important, even down to her trial and execution, turning
Yeah.
up in black and looking that reading from her Bible and looking that staged sort of view of a virtuous religious female
Mm.
looking at the true faith. I think Jane was very clever about how she was seen
Mm.
whilst she was in prison as well, and how she acted on the scaffold. Unfortunately, again, the execution itself is surrounded by myth.
Mm.
We use a lot. We use a book. There's a little pocket book which is stored within the British Library, known as the Chronicles of Queen Jane in the First 2 Years of Mary. And we use a lot. We use this book a lot for our information around Jane, because it was written at the time of
Okay.
events. Sadly, the the pages where Jane is executed, the story cuts off the minute she leaves the minute she gets to the scaffold.
Right.
And we this book was translated and published in the 19th century. And
Mm-hmm.
what they did was they inserted what is now believed to be the most famous part of the film where she's grew up in for the block, and
Mm.
someone actually has to take her to the block to be executed.
The one that
They
one of the
insert
more modern day paintings has been done with her with the long red hair, sort of like you say, with the blindfold groping. Yeah.
the Delaroche painting, yeah. They inserted this description, which is a really, really detailed description of somebody's execution.
Mm.
And this appeared in a pamphlet within a few months after Jane's death. All of the snippets of information that you get about Jane's execution doesn't mention anything about fumbling for the block. It doesn't mention anything, you know, about that incident. It basically states that she died a good death,
Right.
that everything was fine. And yeah, so these pamphlets started to appear. And don't get me wrong, there is some authenticity to some of the letters that are written in these pamphlets. They are believed to have been smuggled from the tower, and they've been signed by Jane herself. However, yeah, just the details surrounding her execution again is that little bit. Did this happen? Didn't it
Mm.
happen? We're still very unsure.
Do we? I mean, there's a couple of things from a sort of a sexism point of view. that I've sort of noticed before. Firstly, why do people refer to her as Lady Jane? Why not Queen Jane? Because she was a queen, albeit for 9 or 13 days, whichever number you go for. And also, was there no real account done by the chroniclers at the time of her death because she was a woman?
So to go to the first question, I suppose the question, I mean, I like to think, well, why isn't she known as Lady Jane Dudley? Why isn't she known by the name that she actually died by? As well. The question of Queen Jane is again a really complex one. I suppose it's how we look at it. I believe that Jane was Queen of England for 13 days, and England was ruled in Jane's name for 13 days. So I believe that Jane should be known as Queen of England. And actually, she is acknowledged on the royal website. Her reign is acknowledged on the British Royal website. And the only thing is, we will never really know the truth about that unless we get another Queen Jane. So will she be Jane II or Jane I? It's a really complex one. We do have people that like to follow the order of precedence again and believe that Jane's reign was a blip and that it didn't exist. For me, it's documented, it's there, and England was ruled at one point by 2 queens. So I personally think she should be acknowledged as a Queen of England.
I mean, some people have said to me when I've raised this before, who are not Jane experts. So this is why I'm just calling her Jane. I'm not Grey, Dudley, Queen, Lady Jane. That is because she never had a coronation. That's why she's not known as Queen Jane. And my argument to that is, well, Edward V didn't have a coronation, yet he's still down as King Edward V. So that's what I mean about the sort of, is it just almost like, I know you're male yourself, but is it like historical misogyny that because she's a woman, she's not as important?
I just think there was an element to try and eradicate the reign, to be honest with you. Again, there was that element stemming right back from the time that, you know, she was no longer queen. There was people were just trying to sort of wipe it away from history, that it didn't happen, but it did. And I think that has followed down the centuries. And again, these are the interesting things there, where, you know, we're getting all these fantastic new biographies by some really good historians that are actually going, no, this did happen, and this is what's there. As for a description of her execution, I don't know whether that has anything to do with her gender. I just think that has something to do with the product of the time, that she was just, they were more bothered about documenting that the event had happened and not had actually happened during the event. You know, Jane was no longer there and she was no longer a threat.
What sort of leader do you think she would have made had it not happened? Had Mary not decided to challenge her? Had society said, okay, this is who the king wanted, we'll give her a chance? What kind of leader do you think she'd have made?
I think she's a very good one. I think she would have, you know, I think all the signs were there for a really good, strong queen. However, I also think today that if she had have lived and she had have reigned, you know, would she have been seen the same as Edward and the same as Mary and the same as Elizabeth, as pros and cons of reign? You know, would Jane have gone to the point where she would started to execute Catholics? We don't know that. But I think that the story would have been entirely different. And but I do think that there was all the elements were there that she would have been a very, very good queen.
I think she'd have made a good queen. I think she'd have made an even better royal advisor to someone else who was the one because to me, with her academic prowess, the research and the looking into things and looking into the pros and cons of things and assessing information, her ability to do that would have been. I just can't get. I was learning to speak Greek for a holiday this year, and I'm not stupid. And even I was like, trying to learn to speak Greek, and I could speak a few words, but by the age of 15, 16, to be able to translate an entire book, that was just mind blowing. So she must have had levels of intelligence that, I mean, we talk about Nicola Tallis's book. She would have been at that level if she was now. She would have been a Nicola Tallis, a Susanna Lipscomb, or the lady who I've just completely forgotten her name, Mary Beard. Is it Mary Beard, the historian Mary Beard? I think it's Mary Beard. Anyway, all these amazing female scholars who, yeah, she would have been one of them. Given if this hadn't happened to her, she would have been. I mean, yeah, obviously
And
it would have
it's
been.
like what I said earlier on, that people were actually genuinely quite interested in what was going to come from this individual. Her love of learning and her learning, that the amount of things that she was learning was causing shockwaves, that
Yeah.
she was actually quite she was something.
Yeah, to be that accomplished academically at such a young age.
Sadly, it didn't turn out.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, and yeah, like it's just so sad that the story ended the way it ended.
Yeah. So
because it could have been better.
Definitely. I think we could probably talk about this for a lot longer. But from a ghost perspective, you rarely, I know that she's meant to be seen, her and Guildford are meant to be seen walking the ramparts at the Tower of London. I find that kind of a bit, because they were kept separate, weren't they, when they were in the tower? They weren't kept together. But Anne Boleyn is seen everywhere. Everyone has an Anne Boleyn ghost story, which, as a paranormal investigator, I'm a bit, yeah, okay, about. What surprises me is there's not more Lady Jane, Queen Jane stories. But when I visited the Tower of London a couple of years ago, I knew the person who lived in what was Queen's House. And he took me into some of the cells that still survive. And I remember walking into this one and not knowing its background, but suddenly getting completely and utterly overwhelmed. And my friend who I was with can verify, because he was quite worried. I started pacing, wringing my hands. I suddenly he said, I suddenly looked like I was about 20 years, 30 years younger than I am. He said, you had a tear just trickling down your face and you're pacing, doing like wringing your hands up and down. I didn't know I was doing it. He sort of grabbed me and was like, you're right. And I was like, oh, I had to get out. It was just overwhelming. And that's when he said, this is one of the places they think that Jane was kept.
Right.
But it's not one of the places that the public get to see, because it's part of it. You have to go through King's House now to get to it. And actually, that was when I first started looking into her, because that was like, really? Did I just channel something? Because it was the fact that I remember sort of looking back at it, I did feel very, very young. I was pacing, and he said I was wringing my hands, and he said, you just had one tear trickling down. You weren't crying, you just had a tear trickling. And I mean, it could be anyone I was picking up on, but it just makes me, with a character as strong as she was, her and people who believe in the paranormal believe in energy and everything else. She must have had such an amazing energy about her. It's just, why are there not more ghost stories of Jane?
Yeah. I mean, it isn't something I've really sort of dig deep into, but I mean, there is a few out there. There's a few sightings. There's a few sightings of Bradgate Park.
Hmm.
She apparently appears on the 24th of December every year
Okay.
at Bradgate Park, apparently. Um, and there is obviously the sightings at the tower.
Mm,
There is also sightings of Guildford. Guildford is apparently often seen and heard in his cell. His cell
mm,
still exists. Um, it's my understanding that we have um, documented information that Jane was kept in the house of Nathaniel Partridge,
mm,
which was on the Green. Um, and today this house doesn't exist anymore.
mm.
She was on the upper floor of the house of Nathaniel Partridge. I might be completely wrong. She might have stayed somewhere else.
No, I trust you. It was just say it was just I know this is what I was told, but then
Yeah,
again, I know I've also been told stuff about the tower, which when I've looked it up, it's not 100% accurate. But it was the fact that I suddenly felt I didn't know her story then. Well, I knew who Jane was. I knew she was the sort of the 9 Day Queen. Um, and I knew that she'd married Guilford Dudley. That's pretty much all I knew about her at that point. But it was the fact that I suddenly was overwhelmed with this. It's weird. It was almost a knowledge that I was coming to my end, and I
yeah,
wasn't sobbing. I was more stressed about how I was going to deal with it, and just with it was very strange because I don't recall crying, but my friend who I was with said I had a tear just trickling down my face like someone who was just overwhelmed with
yeah.
emotion, and I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, she definitely does have a presence in the tower.
Mm,
Even, there is there is the carvings in the wall,
mhm,
there is the tombstone. She definitely has some sort of presence in the tower, and the tower are very good at keeping a story going.
mm,
Uh, like what you said, a lot of the stuff. I was there recently, and I had one of the yeoman warders announced that she came through Traitor's Gate, and Jane never entered the tower through Traitor's Gate. She was queen when she entered the tower, and she never left.
that was
She
that was Elizabeth who came in through Traitor's Gate, wasn't it? Didn't Elizabeth come in through Traitors?
So Elizabeth's supposed to have come through Traitor's Gate. However,
Yeah,
even it's debated as to whether she came through Traitor's
yeah.
Gate or she came through another gate, which is on the wharf.
Mm,
Um, there is some stuff that is said by on the tours that yeah you need to take with a pinch of salt.
mm,
Um, but she definitely does have a presence at the tower, and it is really nice that people do keep her memory alive.
mm.
But,
Definitely. I mean, people like yourself with your brilliant website, your labor of love with that, it's wonderful. And I would say to anyone, even if you've never really thought about looking into Jane and her story, this website it's got so much information on it. It's absolutely brilliant. Um, so if you could give anyone one message about Jane who's never really looked into her before, like I hadn't until I started this whole process, what would your message be to anyone thinking of reading up on her and finding out about her?
um, my message would be, please do look into her. She's so interesting.
Mm,
For a young female that lived over 450 years ago, she is extremely interesting and was extremely talented.
mm,
And um, you know, I would advise to buy some of the more modern books, Nicola's book,
mm,
Linda de Leslie's book. Um, it's nothing against the older books. However, there is lots of new stuff that is coming out
mm.
about Jane, and like I said earlier on, we're trying to get to the as close as possible to the real Jane.
Yeah.
Uh, and these books definitely do.
Mm,
They they bust those myths that surround her, and she does jump off the pages, and
mm.
she is extremely she's just an extremely charming and interesting character to read about.
Definitely. Definitely. I agree. I agree.
Those um like what we said earlier on, is one of those characters where a little bit of that human comes across every once in a while. You see that teenage girl, you you can, well, you can't even identify how brave that teenage girl was towards the end.
Mm,
That something that is extraordinary, how she dealt with that whole situation. Um, she is an extremely brave and fascinating character to read about.
definitely.
There is one thing about ghosts that I do remember reading about, and this was something to do with one of the peers at Jane's trial. So one of the judges
Right,
at Jane's trial,
right,
apparently went he went mad towards the end and was asking to have Jane taken away from him.
right.
He had sentenced Jane to death. I think he was called Judge Morgan. Um,
Well, that's
whether
ironic because that's my married name.
whether he was trying to come to terms with the fact that he'd sentenced somebody so young to death,
Yeah.
or whether seeing Jane is a different
Ooh.
story. But yeah, there is that tale about Judge Morgan and him trying to come to terms with what had happened. But yeah,
Interesting.
anybody that has a slight interest in Tudor history, she's definitely one to look up.
Definitely. Definitely. And say the strings from her story lead into so many other Tudor
Absolutely.
stories, and you know, when you start researching one and you've got a bit of knowledge about another one, you're like, oh, that's where the link is from him to him, and her to her, and yeah, you get names. Say we mentioned Thomas Seymour. Obviously he's got a lot of links to Elizabeth because he's supposed to have been inappropriate with her when she used to go and stay there. You've got the Dudley side of things with Robert Dudley, and then going down so yeah, it's a very interesting.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is very interesting. I mean, there is no evidence of anything like that with Thomas Seymour towards Jane. There's nothing
Yeah.
because Jane was there at the time. So Jane was actually in the same household as
Yeah.
all this was supposed to be going on. And there's nothing to state that anything happened, and there's nothing to actually state that Jane was even questioned about it or anything. Um, but yeah, they all connect. All these stories connect, and you know, Mary. As I said earlier, the signs show that Mary had quite a close relationship with Jane. Elizabeth didn't particularly. I think Elizabeth was a bit
Indifferent.
different, and Elizabeth lived with that threat of Jane's sisters, and it travelled right down the 16th century. That one event.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that amazing knowledge with us. I say I could sit here listening to it for ages, and I think keeping this young woman's memory alive and correcting some of the misconceptions about her, but not just her, some of the other key elements in the story, some of the other key players in the story. I think it's sort of trying to make people understand what they were going through at the same time to try and sort of keep things running smoothly. I think it's all very yeah, it's all important. It's important. So thank you so much. I will be directing people obviously to your website, and you've got a Facebook page and a Twitter page as well for Lady Jane, haven't you? Yep.
I do.
Yep, I'll be directing people to those as well. And yeah, thank you ever so much for your time, Lee. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope I haven't waffled on too much because I
No, no. Well, as an interviewer, it makes my life a lot easier when I've got guests who waffle, because then I don't have to keep thinking of things to ask them. Well, thank you for listening to that episode of Haunted Histories. I hope you enjoyed it. Do make sure you go and check out Lee's website and his social media pages to learn even more about the amazing Jane. On that note, there will be hopefully another podcast before the end of the year, but thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to check out the previous recordings.
Have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.